This is That's So Second Millennium, where we explore issues at the interface between science, philosophy, and Catholic theology. I'm your host, Paul Giesting, and your co-host is Bill Schmidt.
Welcome back to episode 145 of That's So Second Millennium. Today, Bill and I interview the scholar Paul Seungoh Chung, the author of God at the Crossroads of Worldviews. Paul is a theologian, and I would also say philosopher and historian of philosophy. So the context of his book is a search for a common ground from which to discuss the existence of God in today's intellectually and, of course, really in humanities fractured intellectual landscape where we all inhabit different worldviews and we have a very difficult time crossing those boundaries, coming to crossroads where we can discuss things with each other in a way that makes sense, that we would call rational, that we would understand as rational. So that is what we spend most of the podcast discussing. Paul also has his own podcast series, which is almost more like an audio class where he is walking through. He has a very clear idea of where he wants to go. And so he's walking through what would be a follow-up to the book, where he walks through an encounter at the crossroads between himself as a theist and someone in more of a modern atheistic worldview, where in that worldview God is just this additional thing that is mysterious and annoying, why we would want to posit this extra unnecessary being that is God, and trying to explain to such a person the position that God occupies in a theistic worldview, as well as pointing to things within that atheistic worldview. This is the real trick. Difficult, but by no means impossible, to point to things in that atheistic worldview that correspond to what the theist believes God to be, especially a theist who is, of course, from a mature theological tradition, especially like that exemplified by Aquinas, where God is the ground of rationality in some sense. That doesn't quite do justice to the way he uses the term in the book. So both the book, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews, and the podcast, What Do You Mean God Speaks, we'd strongly recommend that you look into. And so with that, I will leave you with our interview with Paul Seungoh Chung. Thank you so much. All right. Well, welcome back to this episode of That's So Second Millennium, where we're very pleased to have Paul Seungoh Chung. Sorry, butchered that a little bit, but the author of God at the Crossroads of Worldviews on the podcast today. He is a philosopher. He has taught at the University of Toronto. He also is the protagonist, author, primary voice, only voice, I believe, of the podcast. The voice of the podcast, What Do You Mean God Speaks? So the book is going to be a major topic today. The subjects he raises in the podcast will be a major topic today. And they concern the arguments that we have in the modern world and their roundaboutness and, arguing past each other. Incommensurability, I believe, is a term that you use repeatedly in the book. And trying to find a way to do something more constructive with a philosophic debate over whether God exists in the context of our modern society, our modern philosophical commitments, and the existence of modern science and what relevance it has toward the debate as such. So, and of course, we're also very happy to have Bill.
Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So, where do you want to get started? What's the genesis of this project, or what in your background, Dr. Chung, led you to go in this direction? And I believe you just said that this was the book is fundamentally inspired by your work for your doctoral dissertation.
So when I enter my PhD, I don't know how it is for a lot of other people who enter their PhD, but I have noticed in the area of theology, which is actually what my PhD is, I noticed that a lot of people have difficulty when they're trying to figure out what they want to write for their dissertation. In my case, I knew pretty much from the start, which was I want to talk about why we have such trouble when we are trying to debate or even just generally converse about God, and why we seem to just argue past each other, and what's behind that. What's the rational, philosophical, or intellectual sort of underlying assumptions and background and context, which makes us talk past each other, and is there something that enable us to go beyond that? So I pretty much directed my entire PhD, studies, checking out and investigating different aspects to this question, which then led to the dissertation, and which then, after like a year or so of revision, became this book. So I guess the motivation behind it is because when I was in my university years, I was an agnostic, you could say. But when I say agnostic, it could also mean soft atheist, if you know the terminology. Like there's no reason to believe in God. It's not like I have reasons to not believe in God, but I don't have reasons to believe in God. So I am almost functionally atheist. But yeah. I also grew up in a very committed Christian home with parents I greatly respect in many, many, many different ways, right? Including intellectually, because they're very intellectually honest and careful and everything. So I'm like, okay, there has to be something about Christianity that's worth respecting. But I'm also a skeptic and agnostic, and I went through the years of like working out a lot of things, and I have to say there is a large dimension of like personal experiential way that you sort of encounter God. That's one dimension, but there is also the intellectual sort of reasoning dimension that underlie or set up the foundation of how we think about God. So based on this experience, what I was trying to figure out was what made someone sort of be both agnostic, skeptic, and also willing to sort of think about God, and then sort of walk the journey to believing God. So in a way, it was also a retracing of my own journey, as well as a very, very significant sort of an intellectual question that I had, because you can't get a larger question than like the question of God or ultimate reality, right? So how do you think about that? And during my university years, because of it, I studied not only philosophy but other religious traditions, obviously in a very introductory manner because undergraduate, right? So Hinduism, Taoism, East Asian philosophies, Buddhism, a bit of Islam, and it all went into that. So I guess what I came up with was that we have to, whenever we speak in questions like this, we have to think in terms of like entire worldviews, how a particular belief is sort of intertwined with a larger way of not only like a set of beliefs, but a larger way of looking at things and even thinking about everything. And if that's the case, the huge question then becomes, if people have these larger way of thinking that is not easy to sort of compare and contrast and figure out which one's wrong, then how do you go from one such like comprehensive position to another comprehensive position and actually communicate in ways that seem, well, at the very least, comprehensible and possibly, plausible. So when I thought about all of these things and put it into writing, it became that book. And hence the title, God at the Crossroads of Worldviews.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, a title that made more and more sense as the book went on. Yeah, for sure. Gosh, where to start from there? Because that concept of worldview is that you have a chapter where you start, chapter 3, the title is something close to The Road, Rationality, and Worldviews. And so immediately the outset of that, from my own actually education, I was privileged that somehow I stumbled into a geology program that actually had a capstone class where he talked about the philosophy of science, which is not a very common experience. And so, of course, we read Popper, we read Kuhn, And so at the very outset, I write, how would you distinguish worldviews from Kuhnian paradigms? And then you talk about Kuhn repeatedly in the rest of the book. So I was like, okay. So I'm not entirely crazy trying to link these two concepts. Maybe you could flesh out for people who aren't necessarily so familiar with both of these concepts, what a scientific paradigm is, what a worldview would be, how you would see those as relating.
Well, you mentioned Popper, right? So one other thing would be like where to start if I'm speaking to a very general audience. There's a Simpsons episode, right? Simpsons.
There is your universal touch point, The Simpsons. Yes.
Right. So, and I think there's like this board meeting for a TV show, and this one like executive woman says it's going to be a new paradigm, and the other person say, hey, isn't the word paradigm like used by people who's, I forgot the exact line, but it's like, who just wants to like pretend they're intelligent, and he gets fired, right? So you have to wonder like, where's the word paradigm comes from, right? And the paradigm is popularized really by Kuhn's work. And what Kuhn's work was doing was that we think science is like simply like linear and cumulative. So you have a whole bunch of facts, and you just add more and more facts from previous facts, and that's it. And that's a very simplified way of putting it, by the way, for those of you who actually knows a bit more, but still a fair point would be Kuhn says that's not really how it works, because he was a historian of science, and that's a big point. He says how science actually operates is that there is something called a paradigm, which is, you can think of it as a larger framework of how you do things, and how like larger ideas of how the world is, and how like science sort of operates in it. I mean, in a very general way to put it. And what that means is that when you get facts, you are also, a lot of those facts and how you gain those facts and how you sort of figure out what those facts are in the first place and make those observations are already framed by an existing larger theoretical setting. So like, what instruments should you use? What's the sort of thing that your science can investigate? What sort of things it doesn't and shouldn't? What sort of questions can you ask, and what sort of questions are like totally invalid and perhaps even unintelligible? Like, it's already all set. And what then happens is that when you have the paradigm set, then you know what to do in science, like in that particular field of science.
And you know how to do ordinary science at that point.
Right. And there's already a set sort of methodology that you follow, and a sort of a very, very, very general way that like you expect your science to turn out. And most of the time it works well. But sometimes there's what he calls anomalies. It doesn't really work. And you would think that if science is like purely rational in a very simplistic and naive sense, then you would think, it doesn't work, so let's get rid of it. It's like, it doesn't work that way, because paradigm is like, you work with it and you get rid of it. You don't know what to do, because that's how you think, right? So you go by that paradigm, and if something goes against it, like if stuff happens and you're like, that's not supposed to happen, you sort of set it aside, and you assume that either you made an error or there was some stuff that the paradigm should explain eventually and stuff like that. But eventually, when anomalies like accumulate until you can't ignore it anymore, what then usually happens is what's called a crisis, where we are not sure of everything, because if the paradigm goes, then all of the stuff that we did, even the stuff that we called facts, are in question, because the way that you got those facts in the first place, you got it by that paradigm, right? So then you had this crisis, and Kuhn argues that it's only overcome when there's another paradigm that solves that crisis. But the problem is the way that paradigm sort of justifies itself, it's like, it shows that it's right, it's based on the paradigm. So I think one of the examples that he gives is Copernicus, the Copernican revolution. And you would think, hey, like, obviously the Earth circles around the sun and not the reverse. But back in those days, it wasn't that obvious, because One, there are a lot of reasons to think that, hey, if the Earth is moving, it's going to feel like it's moving, but it doesn't feel like it's moving. It's pretty stable, except, earthquakes or whatever. Right. And sun looks like it's moving. And they had a very complex set of, astronomical model, which did predict like everything that moves in the heavens. But it was really, really complicated. And that was the reason why they wanted to switch over to Copernicus, right? So, So who's right? Because it wasn't simply a matter of prediction. And there were a whole bunch of stuff that when the Galileo sort of went for the new sort of paradigm, there were reasons to think like, that's just crazy. Obviously, the Earth doesn't move, right? So Kuhn's problem that he raised was it's not a simple thing for an entire paradigm to shift. Usually what happens is the people of the old paradigm just die off. Like they age up and die.
Science progresses funeral by funeral. Yes, I've heard that saying. Yeah.
Which is the reason why he was criticized, or he was accused of being a relativist, which he wasn't. He did say, well, there are like some rational reasons why you would then switch over to the paradigm, but he wasn't clear about it. Yeah. And I argued in my book that it was McIntyre that comes out and really explains why Kuhnian paradigms can shift. So that's like that took longer than I wanted for the explanation for paradigms, but it's related to worldviews in the sense that at least at an intellectual level, because worldviews include a lot of other dimensions. And if you're curious about that, read Ninian Smart, for example. Although he's even Ninian Smart's more of a classic at this point. But anyway.
I don't see any problem with that.
Yeah. Intellectual sort of dimension of worldviews work in ways that are very similar to paradigms. It frames how you think about things. It sort of tells you what are facts and what you can go for as facts and how you can organize it. And it's not simply a matter of, there's like this one fact that goes against your worldview and you can now discard it. It doesn't work that way, because once you discard your worldview, you don't have any facts at all, because you don't know what you can because facts are like building blocks. That's, I believe, where the etymology comes from factum, which is like make. You have these building blocks and you put it into things so that it forms a worldview. So once you don't have a framework in which to put the blocks, then you're in trouble. So in that sense, worldviews have a frame like paradigm, and the reason why I used that for my book was that, so when you have different worldviews that compete against each other or have seemingly contrasting views, then what you have are the problem or the challenges that you're faced with is very similar to the one that people with different paradigms have, except it's worse, because in Kuhnian paradigms, you have the old paradigm that's being replaced by new. So at least at the very least, people can die off for the old, but when you have competing worldviews, you have things side by side. So you can't say, well, yours is old and now it's going to die. It's like, it doesn't work that way. Yeah. So then it brings us back to the question of, if that's the case, how do you like converse across these competing paradigmatic way of looking at things and thinking about things?
Yeah. It's a thick problem. Do you have something to say, Bill?
No, it makes sense. Although the thing that occurred to me was is another complicating factor for these paradigms, the fact that these building blocks of facts, in a worldview, tried to combine religious facts or kind of supernatural kinds of understandings and scientific and natural understandings. That is a challenging worldview, especially in a world where different people are in different places regarding their secularity or the degree to which their faith determines their understanding of science. In other words, it just seems like it's trying to do this at a global scale is a very challenging meeting of the minds these days.
It's worse. It's actually worse because because one other thing that you have a problem when you have these competing worldviews or even paradigms. You use different vocabulary.
Yes.
Or sometimes, even worse, you use the same word to mean completely different things.
It is the same word, yeah.
The biggest example would be God. Like, people think God in a very, very different way.
Yeah.
Even within supposedly same, like, English-speaking, like, Western secularized culture.
Yeah.
Even the words like supernatural and natural, like, what does that even mean? What does natural mean? And what does supernature means? And for some people, like, supernatural means like ghosts and like wraiths and magic. Whereas at
for
least
that matter, so does metaphysical.
Right. And for classical Christianity, ghosts and like magic and all of that, that actually would belong to nature. Like, if they exist, that would be part of nature, because nature, at least in the way that Christianity has sort of been speaking about it, simply means things that have their own nature. That's like, like human nature. That's what the word means, right? So only thing that's quote unquote supernatural would be God, really, because God doesn't have like this like set thing that he's not I believe the word that I would be using, for example, in my podcast is like, he's not a being among other beings, except with special qualities. That's not what Christians mean by God. Everything that exists would be like nature, in the sense that they have their nature and everything. Then you have something that's beyond. Something is actually a wrong word for it too, but we have to use something. So so something beyond it, like this horizon of reality, so to speak, and that will be quote unquote supernatural. Again, we using words differently, and worse, people don't know that we are using the words differently, and then they try to argue, and then we have a mess.
We have to go all the way back to Aristotle's categories and talk about words being used univocally or equivocally, and we're just not that careful. We're just not that careful. So yeah, I mean, in the context of the book, and I do want to sort of, as great a book as it is, and it's been a very engrossing read. We want to go on and because your book is really meant as a foundation, and you're trying to go beyond that foundation with the work of your podcast and presumably other things you're probably working on in terms of written projects. But you propose, so in chapter 3, you talk about this worldview concept, which itself lives in a worldview. That's the terrifying thing about it. But taking that in stride, we go on and talk about the crossroads of worldviews, and eventually you go on and talk about Aquinas as a prototypical figure who could transcend, who could bring worldviews into discussion with each other, in conversation, as Bill would like to say often. Because he, in some sense, actually belonged to both. He, in some sense, got naturalized in both the Augustinian paradigm of early medieval Christianity, intellectual tradition, and also the Aristotelian paradigm that had swept back in from the Arab East and was, revolutionizing Europe's understanding of natural philosophy and so on.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So Aquinas is, in fact, you could say, of like very, very influential Christian thinkers tend to be that. Augustine was one. He basically put the Neoplatonic sort of way of thinking into Christianity. That's one of, I would say, that's one of the reasons why he's like a founding intellectual figure in Christianity. Aquinas would be another such figure, which is why he figures largely in my book, because he's bringing Aristotelian sort of philosophical worldview, you could say, and he's integrating that with the Christian worldview. And what's very interesting is that he was successful. It was supposed to be like this very incommensurable sort of way of understanding and thinking about everything. And it was, I believe, I think I quoted this in the book too. It was so bad at one point where the natural philosophy, you could say, like in our terms today, the scientific and like the university, secularized university would be like Aristotelian in thinking, and theology would be Augustinian / sort of Neoplatonic. Then and people would sort of quip in writing, saying theology has like one statement, and philosophy has some other statement, and that's how it is. And then Aquinas. Aquinas wouldn't be the only one. There would be people that would have been working the project. His mentor, Alban Magnus, I believe, would have been, he would have inherited that from his mentor, and he brought them together. And what's very interesting is that a philosopher named Bertrand Russell in the 20th century, and he was very, how should I put it? He was very disdainful of Christianity.
He was disdainful of a lot of things. Yeah.
Yes.
This disdain characterizes Bertrand Russell in many, many ways.
Right. I don't want to rag on him for his philosophical achievement, right? His logical atomism was a pretty great achievement for his era of his generation. But I've also read his philosophy of history of Western philosophy, and it's a terrible book. Because I was an undergrad student, and I wanted to know what happened in his philosophy, and he was witty, but when I was reading through it, I'm like, I don't get what these ancient people thought, because Bertrand Russell kept getting in and making his own comments. But what was interesting was that he was like very disdainful of Aquinas. It's like, he's not even really a philosopher, but he also says like he actually was successful in integrating Aristotelian philosophy and Christianity. But it's like, but who cares about that? And I'm like, I care, because combining two different worldviews is something that we today consider to be impossible. And you're saying, despite your disdain, that it was actually done before. And I mean, Russell wouldn't have cared about that, because he wouldn't have believed that there can actually be multiple different ways of thinking about things. He thought logical atomism was pretty much the universal thing that everyone should follow anyway. So that's where the difference is. So Aquinas does that. And what I found interesting, which then I put into the book, was that his supposed philosophical arguments for the existence of God, which a lot of philosophers, not the Aquinas scholars, mind you. I mean, contemporary philosophers just thinking about the question about God.
Richard Dawkins taking that single page out of the Summa and thinking he understands it, for example.
Right, but I don't count him as a philosopher.
In Dawkins, of course, is not a philosopher.
But yes.
But there are philosophers who do something similar.
Yes, so philosophers who take that page and say, this is like the proof that Aquinas gives for the existence of God. But if you actually go and read the Aquinas scholars of Aquinas, they say, actually, no, because the arguments, the 5 ways, for example, the arguments for the existence of God, that one page, would have been regarded as something like he repeating pretty much the way that Aristotelian and Platonic philosophers thought about reality as such. So none of the people there would have been like, oh, no, I disagree. They would be like, obviously we would think about it that way. Obviously, there are causes going, and obviously you can't infinitely regress, because what's the point of doing any sort of intellectual inquiry? That's how they would have thought. And what's interesting is that after Aquinas makes, he sort of references this way of thinking, he then says, this is what we call God. He doesn't say, therefore God exists. He says, that thing that in your intellectual inquiry sort of arrive at already, and you already are searching or seeking it or thinking about it already, that's granted. You already believe that. We call that God, or we name that God. So it's more of a identifying process rather than argumentative process. The arguments actually come later when he says, okay, that thing, that reality that you call God has certain qualities. And he argues through that for the rest of the section 1 of the Summa, you could say. And then it's almost like drawing a portrait, right? Like you have this general portrait that everyone sort of has the same shape because it's a portrait, right? It's like face, head. Then what Aquinas and what I propose that we need to do is that then you draw in from this general shape into a very particular portrait, and that portrait happens to be like God, like in the case of Aquinas, the Christian God, right? And that's the project, rather than trying to argue that, hey, that guy in the portrait exists, because no, it's granted that it's a portrait of something. And is it an accurate portrait? That's the actual question.
Yeah. And the 5 ways, so you mentioned it as an identification process. And at the same time, it seems to me like it's a consensus building process. That
Yes.
It's the point of, it's the bridge between the two worldviews. Hey, we agree on this. This is just, we just happen to have these different terms for it, perhaps. But hey, we're on the same page here, and we can start from here.
Which is what I call a crossroad. You are essentially identifying where the crossroad is. So worldviews would have been, because another way that I describe worldviews is it's like a journey, right? We are always moving and changing our views, and we are journeying through things. So you have seen different sort of landscapes, so to speak, metaphorically, and you have been following along a different road. If you understand both worldviews, then you can bring it to a crossroad where people are looking at least at that crossroads of worldviews, people are looking at the same scenery, sort of, but they call it different things. So you come by a crossroad and say, here's a crossroad, here's the horizon. What do you call that? And it's like, oh, it's a sky. Well, we call that God, that kind of thing, right? So what Aquinas then does is say, well, here's the Augustinian sort of road, here's the Aristotelian sort of road, and I know where it can cross. And I know at which point we can sort of look at things, and I will be able to point that and say, that's what we mean by God. And then we can start the rest of the journey, because that's an important part. You don't, like, this doesn't prove that God exists. It's more like, here's what we mean by God, and now we need to take the journey. We need to think back to the journey that we had before and like rethink the whole thing. So that we understand what was going on, and then we need to sort of map our journey to the future so that we find out that the portrait that we are drawing, so to speak, or the map in this case, actually is the right map, or is a correct map, right? But
it describes a real country.
Yes.
Yeah. There was a point related to this. I mean, so with Aquinas as a crossroads figure. So you spend a lot of the book, chapters 2 through 4, and also chapter 7, discussing the sort of critical, catastrophic failure of the sort of Enlightenment epistemological project, which is a bit of a mouthful. But this idea, and you already alluded to it with Russell. Russell would have been a late proponent of this idea that there is this achievable, neutral, rational ground, whether I think it's logical atomism or whatever Descartes or Kant's or Spinoza's or whoever's formulation of it. So I wanted to bring that into conversation with you. You have this idea that goes all the way back now to Plato and Aristotle, that, or at least some of the scholarship that you, and I forget the source that you mentioned in this context, who talks about the rational ground as the goal of classical Greek philosophy. How would you contrast that rational ground with this never land of the Enlightenment project that we can't actually get to because we actually all have worldviews?
Now, before that, I want to be sympathetic to the Enlightenment project, because what they were facing was that there were religious wars and people were killing each other over different views. So they said, we need a way to sort of reason things out, right? And Descartes, for example, would have been aware of the stuff that was happening, and that's what they were aiming for. And in some ways, it was a very powerful project, and it got it became a bedrock, not the bedrock, but at least a bedrock of modern society. And in that sense, it has been a tremendous source of like great progress and intellectual sort of advancement and everything. So in that sense, I don't want to sort of demean the Enlightenment in any way. But at the same time, when we think about it in the scale of like thinking about everything and what reality is and God and stuff like that, and in that sense, Kant was, you could say, right in a way, because he like his voice was like a caution, like there's only so far reason can get you, at least in terms of like metaphysical questions. But then I for me, his error was like then throwing out the entire metaphysical question as not a rational discussion. But having said that, you could say the mistake of the Enlightenment philosophy of rationality is that there is like this universal rationality, universal methodology, you could say, if you want to simplify it, universal method of getting answers about everything, right? Yeah. And that just happens to be for a lot of people like pure science as it exists now. That's another big thing, because Aristotelian way of thinking would have been like, we have the science, but who knows what it's going to look like 1,000 years from. I mean, nowadays we would say the same thing, but we act as if like our current science should answer everything, including God, and everyone should follow this one specific method, and it will work for all times. And that's the assumption that we sort of brought into with the question of God, when, as you also mentioned, there are different worldviews, and what that means is that there are different ways of reasoning about things when you get comprehensive enough. Because obviously, say like a Hindu and a Christian and a atheist would still say like general theory of relativity is true. Like we can work on physics, and we don't have to have like alternate physics, right? But then if you pull that question into a higher level or a more comprehensive level, saying what does that mean for understanding what reality is as a whole? Like, is it materialism? Is it Platonism? Is it some sort of theism? Or those questions? It's not definitive enough, right? Mm-hmm. And for that, different way of thinking and reasoning sort of exists there. Enlightenment project would have been thinking that no, we could go all the way up, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas the rational ground that I talk about, at least in terms of Platonism and Aristotelianism, and it would be a mistake to sort of put them into our question of like, can there be different worldviews? Because I don't think they quite thought about it in that sense. I mean, they would have been aware of different sort of traditions and everything, but their sort of discussion was more like, is truth relative? That's for example what Socrates was asking. It's like, no, that can't be it, and that's true. But at the same time, can there be different ways of reasoning about things? Perhaps. I don't know whether that was such a huge question for them as it is for us today, where we actually do have like people from many, many different cultures and worldviews competing. So what rational ground meant then, and how I'm sort of using it in the book, is that how should I put it? This has to do with the question of God as well. So it has to do with how you envision what an intellectual inquiry is, right? Mm-hmm. So, for example, Alistair McIntyre, I think I mentioned him earlier in this episode.
Yeah. By the way, about McIntyre's concept of telos frequently in that section, I believe.
Yes, and he's getting it from Aristotle and Plato, right? Yeah. So what he's pointing out is that like we don't follow Aristotle's physics anymore, but the way that but and we think like most of his philosophy is like history, like respectable historical philosophy, a philosopher in history, but nothing more than that. But Alistair McIntyre's point is, well, no, the way that we sort of envision intellectual inquiry hasn't really changed. At least from that time. Why? Because, well, here's how he would have envisioned how science works, right? Knowledge works. And it's something like, so when we learn about stuff, like we do it by, I'm trying to put it into English language here, sort of like an empirical inquiry. So you like look into stuff, you inquire about it, you make observation, and you also have what's called dialectics, which is like you argue about it, you make rational argumentation for and against it, so you can figure out like what's a logical way of thinking about these things, and all of that goes into science, and so you gain more and more knowledge about stuff in a particular given field, right? But then what you're actually aiming for is this ideal notion of finished, like completed field of inquiry, right? So what would that look like? And obviously, we don't have any finished field of inquiry, but we are at least aiming for it, because otherwise, what are you doing, right? If you don't have a goal of some activity, then you're not doing anything that's intelligible. So the implicit goal of any sort of intellectual inquiry, including science, is that you're trying to get to a point where you have like these set of like fundamental principles of that field. And from that, so you can say in physics, like ultimate laws of physics. So if you know that, if you actually reach that, then from those principles and laws, you can deductively figure out everything that happens that's observable in that field from those principles. So again, in terms of physics, if you know the ultimate laws of physics and everything about those laws, then you can figure out everything that physics cover, like why, for example, in cosmology, for example, why there's Big Bang and how things unfold and all of that deductively from the laws alone. Now, you arrive at that knowledge from, say, empirical inquiry and logical argumentation, but when you finish it, that's where you want to end up. Now, what Aquinas was actually arguing about is that you know that thing that you're aiming for in the very end telos, the ultimate laws of physics and all of that. You have to assume that they exist, otherwise your inquiry doesn't make sense, right? You have to assume that laws of physics exist for physics to make sense. You have to assume that there are principles that underlie biology, for example, for studying biology. Those ends. If you go all the way to so that it includes every one of those things into a single system, because that's what you're aiming for, because even now we think biology can't be inconsistent with, say, chemistry, and chemistry can't be inconsistent with physics. Everything needs to connect. So when everything connects, and that's the rational ground, so in that sense, the rational ground of you doing any sort of intellectual inquiry, like what are your implicit assumptions that make you think that what you're doing as a scientist actually matter, right? And it will actually get somewhere. In that sense, it's the rational ground. And that's what Plato and Aristotle was trying to work on. It's like, why are we thinking about why would rational thinking matter? Well, because we think reality is rational in that sense. So that thing that you're aiming for, Aquinas was saying, that's what we call God. Which is why I don't need to make a separate argumentation, because you already believe it, right? So, I'm just saying that's God. So now then we need to argue about other things like, okay, is God simple in the sense that is God made up of different parts? No. Is God good? Yes. That sort of argumentation, which happens in the later chapters. So that's what it means.
Just to round off the book and hopefully transition to sort of transcend the book a little bit. I mean, in your final chapter, which I haven't quite finished yet, but you, in fact, the last 2 pages that I've read, you bring up Hawking's book on, which one is it? Brief History of Time, I believe, and discussion of ultimate laws as a potential, so the question, no matter what your, physics, your current modern physics conception of the universe is, whether you believe in a multiverse or whatever other hypothesis you subscribe to, there's always the question of, and why does it there, and what are the laws that it obeys, and for that matter, why should that be the state of the affairs that things obey these laws? Oh, that's all that we mean by God, or that is in some sense what we mean by God. That's related. That's our hopefully common point of departure. Is that at least a reasonable approximation of where you're starting to head in that chapter? So
you want to be specific, because you can't just say that's what we mean by God, period, right? But I use Stephen Hawking specifically because he is an atheist. He's he's confessed atheist, and he does that very, very explicitly in the book Grand Design. But in that very book, Grand Design, he has this interesting statement where he says, you can think of God as the embodiment of ultimate laws of nature. And see, because that's actually how it works. Embodiment is an unfortunate choice of words.
That's a potentially problematic term,
Yes, but that it came from Stephen Hawking is significant, because what I'm pointing out is that, well, if I follow sort of the Aquinas-like argument and make a crossroad there, then the crossroad, and you have to be very specific with the crossroad, because crossroad between exactly what, right? Crossroad between Christianity, understood in a very, very general way, obviously, and scientific naturalism, but not just scientific naturalism in the context of cosmology, right? So in the context of cosmology and physics, then what Stephen Hawking would have called like the ultimate laws of nature. And he literally says, like explicitly writes that we don't need God because like laws like gravity, like these laws of nature makes the universe come, like universe gets generated. And because he's actually thinking in terms of, because if you live in a different worldview and you have a pretty much an alien worldview sort of impinging upon your understanding, and they tell you stuff, then often what happens is that the central ideas of the other worldview becomes like this alien entity that's just out there, right? So you have your world, which you can explain more or less, right? At least in a workable way. And it's like, it works. I mean, there are a whole bunch of questions that I can't answer, but, you know, it works in terms that I think laws of nature, ultimate laws of physics, tells me how universe can be generated, maybe even a multiverse. And you're telling me I need this, like this alien entity on top of it? Like, why should I? But because he's Hawking, I think, he goes a bit further, saying maybe you mean by like this God, like ultimate laws of nature, and if that's the case, then well, okay, like okay with that. And it's like, okay, that's an interesting point, because that's exactly what I would predict, at least with my book. But then he says, but with God, you need more, you need miracles, which is again right. But then he says, but miracles would mean that laws of nature would need to be like violated, and I don't see that happening with laws of physics, which is where I sort of go against the saying, I don't think that's quite precisely the right understanding of what miracles are.
No. Right?
And you need to go far beyond that to figure out what that actually means in Christianity. But in the context of physics, and when I speak with people who's sort of out to get Christianity, and I had a recent conversation with one person regarding that. They get impatient because they say, "What do you mean in the context of like do you believe in God or not?" I'm like, "No, because you can't just fast forward these questions because it's a large question." So in the context of physics, where you're thinking about reality in terms of laws of nature that underlies, and you think about it in that sense because that's the rational ground, in the sense that this is what makes you as all your works as a scientist make sense, and that sort of rationality of reality is what we call God, but only in that specific context. For the rest, we need to carry that dialogue and journey forward. That one of the big things that we need to do is that we need to then sort of revisit and trace out the entire narrative journey of Christianity from that crossroad, because now we can place ourselves, right? So you don't make like silly misunderstanding of like you don't understand what the term God means. Now we sort of do. So from that we trace out the entire journey, and it is from the entire journey that you get a better idea or a better sense of what it means to say that you believe in God, right? So you need the entire journey. This is only the starting point, which is why that book, I said, is pretty much just a foundational matter. It sets the frame to start the journey, right? So that's what I mean. So what I wanted to head off in that final chapter, and I do that sort of in the beginning of my podcast series as well, is that we have this notion, especially in the more secularized conversation, that when we talk about God, we have like this alien, as I mentioned with Stephen Hawking, that talk about Stephen Hawking. We are like this alien entity, and it is an entity. It's a very powerful entity. It's apparently like super intelligent and all knowing, whatever that means, and it can do stuff like a Superman. But he's invisible and untouchable. But he's there. Like you should just believe that he's there, and that's the sort of like notion that people have of God. So then the question is, can you prove that this invisible, super powerful, and super knowing entity is there somewhere among everything in the world? And that doesn't make sense for Christianity. Like if you are in a different worldview and you try to understand Christianity or any theistic worldviews for that matter, that's the mistake that you get. And what I was trying to do is say, okay, forget about your Superman. He doesn't exist. You don't think he exists. We don't think he exists.
No, there is no bearded white guy in a chair up on a cloud somewhere, even though that's the caricature version of God that's so often being argued against.
Yeah, and even if you make it very, very, philosophically more respectable in coming up with a better conceptual description. He still doesn't exist because that's not what we mean. Yeah. I think there's a theologian named David Bentley Hart. He used an example that I also used in my podcast, and I didn't know that he used it.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing. He says, what did he say? I used Hamlet, but he used Anna Karenina for Tolstoy.
Anna Karenina. Okay, yeah.
Anna Karenina. Yeah, that's the one. And he said a lot of these debates about existence of God in either in scientific or even any sort of does God exist setting. It's almost like people in Anna Karenina arguing about the author, saying is there a particular page where the author appears, and maybe it's in the beginning of the chapter, but we don't see the author at page 1, and we don't see any specific design of writings and stuff that shows and he says,
I don't see Tolstoy's book anywhere. Yeah.
I don't see Tolstoy anywhere.
Yeah. I don't see Shakespeare in here anywhere. Yeah.
Yeah, and I use that for Hamlet, but he's more combative. So the way that he put it was that then these people contemptuously dismiss anyone that says, well, no, the author shouldn't exist anywhere in the book, and they don't listen to him. Whereas I think the way that I put it is that, well, if you're trying to place God in that sense, and you have think about it in terms of author, same idea. In Hamlet, where is the author? Where's Shakespeare? In one sense, nowhere. You're not going to find them anywhere. You're not going to find signs, quote unquote, signs of him anywhere. Yeah. But in another sense,
at the same time,
it is everything. All of the story. And in that sense, when you talk about God, you don't think about it in terms this entity somewhere that's super powerful. It's more helpful at this point, at least, to think about God as all of reality. So in that sense, when you're at a crossroad, you look at the entire horizon of everything. It's that's God. That's what we mean by God. Don't try to find some crazy thing that's out there. That's right. What we mean, right? But at the same time, in terms of science, the closest concept that you have that parallels the concept of God in context of science would be something like the ultimate laws of nature. And in that sense, Stephen Hawking had it right.
Yeah.
Then can we get something beyond that? It's then let's go over the story of how we related with this all of reality and what happened when we related to it and prayed to it or heard voices, which if you just think of it in terms invisible Superman, then you could still ask, maybe you're just being crazy. It's no. If you're talking about reality as a whole, then it's meaningful to say that sometimes we have these experiences that sort of reality is structured in a way that we have these experiences that seem to guide us. So the question is not hey, is this only in our heads? Because again, if you're in a book, right, or if this is a story, people have thoughts in those, protagonists thought this in that story. It's is that from the author? In a sense, yes. So if you have thoughts in your own head, that's still the author. It's also you, but it's also the author. So the only condition that you would be looking for would be if you follow this voice, this thought, is it true? How does the world unfold?
Yeah.
What happens, right? What are the fruits that form, right? And what are some of the things that really messes us up when we don't hear the voice or when we follow the voice wrongly, or that, which is, by the way, I think I covered in the podcast series, why eating a fruit from a tree made humanity fall, because that's an odd story, right? Because you eat a fruit and you're cut off from God. It's if you follow it that way, no, but if I were to sort of shorten that story, they ate the fruit after they distrusted God, because the serpent's you can't trust God. It's he's lying to you. He's your enemy. He's trying to bring you down. And then they eat the fruit of what's called the knowledge of good and evil, which for the Hebrew, it just meant knowledge of good things and bad things that can happen to you, everything in life. And bad things can happen to you. But what if you get that knowledge because you believe that this reality that unfolds things, namely God, is your enemy? Because then you're suspicious of everything that happens to you, and then you become afraid of everything that happens to you because he can be hostile. So what do? You hide. You try to protect yourself. That's what clothes mean, because they become afraid. And when they hear God, they hide. And then they start like attacking each other because, hey, if reality is against me and I'm vulnerable, then I need to get ahead in life, right? And that means if I can beat my wife over the head while she's giving birth, so that she has to depend on me for the rest of her life, and I get to rule over her, I will do that. Right. And that's the story of Genesis. So when you retell the story at the crossroad, it should make more sense. Mm-hmm. But if you don't, and if the story remains alien, then you're alienated from the story, and you're alienated from the journey. Yeah. And that's what my podcast is trying to recalibrate, so that the stories once again become real, and we can actually walk the story and figuring out, like, understanding what's going on and what's happening.
Yeah. Which is, a badly needed project. I mean, I think, Bill, you say frequently how often we need, bridge builders, communicators, people who can help, cross these, as opposed to our, not that human beings haven't always had a tendency to balkanize and split off into their own worldviews and only talk to people who agree with them. But boy, it's so easy to find, and then they splinter, and they've gone down such a tremendously long path of splintering and becoming more and more alienated from each other.
Yeah, and it helps me, if I hope I'm right on this, but that sense of crossroads is, in one sense, it's a vision of a meeting place, a kind of static meeting place where worldviews and people can kind of just meet there, and in that moment of time, they either find agreement or disagreement or clash or whatever. But I think what you're saying so well is that the crossroads is a place like our typical experience of a traffic intersection, where everybody's continuing on in a journey, and it's just as important to meet in that moment of time, but it's also very important to note that everybody's continuing on a journey in their own direction, and the effort is to better understand not just where you think alike in that moment, but where you agree on the origin point, the principles that started that journeyer on his way, and the purpose and the destination of each journeyer and I think that's what I heard happening in your podcast, that people on that journey are trying to get into conversation with God. And so we can all kind of empathize with that.
Yeah, in that sense, it's like an invitation, right?
Yes.
A lot of the times when people with different worldviews come together, it's not a crossroad. It's a no man's land with trenches.
Wow.
That's usually how it happens, right? No man's land with trenches. Yeah. Whereas what I'm envisioning, and the Enlightenment wanted to get across the no man's land with trenches by saying, here's the universal sort of capital city of everything that we're going to set up, where all of you needs to be there.
Right.
Where my argument is that there is no such, like, we tried to build a city, there is no such city. It doesn't work. No one gathers at one place.
Yeah.
There can be different crossroads depending on who meets, right? But to get to a crossroad, we actually need to journey there. We need to get to where the other person is, meet them at the crossroad,
right,
and across the trenches, right, and say, okay, now we can, at least at this point, we can look at the same horizon, and we can sort of point to and say, this is what we mean by God, but you don't think it's God. That's fine, because you haven't had the same journey, but at least you know what we are pointing to, right? At least you know what we are pointing to. So here's an invitation for you to journey together with me. And when you journey together with me, maybe I'll learn something from you, because I think one of the things that the more non-theistic scientific position sort of gave to Christianity, at least in the recent centuries, is that we sometimes, how should I put it? We take things too personally with God. You know what I mean? It's like, oh, it's not sunny. Oh, it's rainy today when I was going to go on a picnic. God hates me. It's like, no. A lot of the things that happen in the world and it's like, oh, well, if that's not, maybe that's not God. Maybe God doesn't hate me. So the rain's not from God. No, the rain is also like, ultimately speaking, from God, in the sense that it follows the laws of physics and presumably. So it's in that sense God, but it's not about you. It's like God's not personally out to rain on your parade.
Right.
A lot of things that happen in the cosmos, which in the way that I put it in my podcast, is it's something that God is speaking. It's we conceive of reality as something like a speech, metaphorically, perhaps even more than that. But so it's something that God speaks, but a lot of that speech is, in a sense, impersonal or perhaps impartial, right? That's another way to put it, right? And it's something that I think more impersonal, you could say, study of nature has given us insight to. So when we invite people on a journey from this crossroad, we can go, they can point stuff out and say, oh, we've made a mistake, or maybe we didn't quite understand things in the way that we could have, at least in the more fuller sense, about God or about life. And we can learn. And hopefully you can see what we've gone through and how life seems to unfold and what happens, for example, if you follow Christ, right? And what he seems to answer on the cross, because that's a crazy story, right? Like, here's a representative of everything that is true and good. And we like torture him and nail him on the cross. But that brings salvation. That's a crazy story. But then there's that context. And okay, what happens if you follow that story along and what that means when you see the empty tomb, for example, or when you believe the empty tomb, whichever. So when you go through the story by being invited on a journey from that crossroad, so that they know where they are and where they come from, right, from their own belief system, and then perhaps the dialogue and the conversation that can happen becomes something meaningful instead of, I don't know, grenades that's thrown over trenches.
Yes.
Which often is the case when you have worldviews that's going against each other.
Fascinating.
And it actually like leads somewhere, right?
Right. That's the real purpose for having a crossroads, so that you can start journeying together and understand each other through the pursuit.
Yeah.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. It's a hopeful vision. It really is. And people, the more you're open-minded, both in terms of individual people and the context of their journeys, and you don't take it personally. I love that idea. Don't take it personally. But the more you see it in its big picture from the crossroads, you can really find some unity there, a unification of the journeys. I hope I'm wording that in roughly accurate terms.
It is a hopeful sort of vision. Sometimes I do feel a bit more cynical than. So it goes up and down, but it is supposed to be a hopeful vision of how people can communicate with each other. Less hopeful in the last several years with what's been happening in the world and politics and everything, but,
Amen, yeah.
but still.
Yeah, it was just go back to the book for a second. It was kind of sobering to read your assessment of. I mean, of course, you're drawing on a lot of people's scholarship in this assessment that Aquinas really, in his era, kind of failed at his project. That he really he did not. His vision did not get understood, and therefore did not get accepted and promulgated in the late Middle Ages.
At the very least, in the way that he was trying. So, yeah. I mean, one thing, a lot of people thought he was heretic. Like, he was a heretic. Yeah. That was one thing. But even after people thought, no, I guess he wasn't a heretic and maybe we should learn from him. But I think what I wrote in the book was that when they decided to learn from him, they couldn't quite figure out that he was trying to put two massively different sort of intellectual systems or worldview together. They just thought, oh, he just made some good arguments, so we're just going to take pieces of here and quote him here and quote him there. And it's like, if you do that, you don't actually understand what he's doing. But they did that anyway, and that sort of continued apparently until 20th century. So
and I mean, and then of course it created the late scholastic, intellectual environment that the Descartes and the Enlightenment rebelled against. And,
So that's the challenge.
You have to perhaps, and the thing, and of course, it's also hopeful at the same time that perhaps now, almost 800 years later, maybe in some ways we're finally starting to understand Aquinas in the terms that he hoped to be understood, or at least to some degree. At any rate, his ideas are seeds for us. They're not seedy. They're seeds that are being, that were planted, and after a very, very long time, perhaps are bearing fruit that he could never have even anticipated. Or at least there's still that potential.
Yeah. So, the book, my book is actually trying to say, or the theme of my book is that a lot of people sort of repeat the content of Aquinas's position, but what we need to learn is the goal, what he accomplished, rather than, because the content gets it gets outdated. You don't follow Aristotelian physics anymore, but what he was trying to accomplish by integrating those things together, that's what we need to do. That's what we need to redo for our generation, and that's going to be a very large project. So when I finished the book and I was publishing it, one of my peers, so it goes through a peer review process, obviously, and one of the peer reviewer, because I got I got recommendations, which is why I got published. He said, this book is sort of like, how did he put it? He caught it right on in that sense. He said, the author is someone like Moses, and like, ooh, Moses, like, so that was that was a compliment, but he actually wanted to say more than that. It's like, he's like Moses in the sense that he sort of brought us right to the edge of the promised land, but he didn't lead us across it. He just showed us the promised land, but we're not there yet. And his sort of implicit comment was like, so when are we getting in? And my answer was, I am working on it, right? But my real answer was, well, I'm going to write this book. People are going to read it. Like, people who are a lot smarter than I am are going to read it, and they're going to come up with the project. So I finished it, waited for a few years. No one starts a project. So I'm like, okay, so if no one starts a project, then I guess I will have to, at least at a more general audience level, which is why I began the podcast series. Podcast series, What Do You Mean God Speaks, is pretty much what that project is supposed to be, right? And that podcast series in turn is like a rough draft of the book that I'm now writing, and which now I have the first draft, which now I'm going to work on heavily, and hopefully try to get it published. So that's where the entire project is right now. But that's the goal. It's like, here's bringing together people, and this is what we mean by God for you people who don't believe in God, but who sort of do believe in, say, science and whatnot. It's like, here's what we mean by God, and here's what our journey has been. Here's what Genesis means, if that's the case. And here's why those crazy stories about fruits are actually supposed to make sense. And here's why flood's supposed to make sense, and why God isn't so like crazy evil for bringing about the flood. It's actually describing aspects of reality that happens. That's what Genesis really is. It's describing the things that you already know is true. But in a grand sense. And that's what flood means, and that's what Babel means, and creation, obviously. And here's what the journey of Abraham means, and what that means for people who's actually trying to converse with all of reality as if reality is a person, and what happened then, and what are some of the problems that you're going to encounter when you try to do so, like when God asked you to sacrifice your son, because that's a big deal. But at the same time, if you understand the entire story in that context, from where we are, from the crossroads, then you will understand that you've actually heard the same call. Like, this is something that you're going to face, because if you're afraid that reality is going to take stuff away from you that you love, because we always are afraid, and the story of Adam and Eve basically is that there was a point where we became afraid of it for a reason. Then when you have Isaac, you're going to be afraid, and you're going to be afraid that God's going to kill your son. So what's the answer to that? Well, you need to bring him, present him before God as an offering, because that's the only way to conquer your fear. And if you do that, then you're going to get your son back. But you're also you will also be freed from being frozen in fear, which is my latest episode. So that's the journey of the story that I'm trying to sort of unfold, hopefully to the very end of the Christian story. That's going to take a while.
But it's a good argument for following your podcast and for awaiting your next book.
Absolutely.
Oh, yes, please do. I am. My podcast is lonely for listeners. Yeah. Well, not. I mean, obviously I have some, but I could always use more.
Right.
Especially from the States and especially from outside Canada.
Yeah. Yeah. I always wonder the devil is in the algorithms, as they say, or at least as I say. So how people are or are not being directed to your podcast. We hope to at least direct a few that direction, because it would be a good thing to follow along and be involved in this project. So, well, that was wonderful, and we've it's almost an hour and 10 minutes at this point. So, but it's been a nice, beautiful, meaty conversation that we're really grateful to have had the chance to have. So, with that, maybe we would always be open to another conversation in the future.
Let's do that, please. Yeah.
I think that would be
great.
Be a wonderful thing. So, any final words, Bill, Paul?
No. Just thank you for the ongoing journey that you've brought us along with of the book, and then more to follow.
Yes, absolutely.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Thank you.
Yes, very grateful, and we hope to do this again in the future. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of That's So Second Millennium. TSSM's audio producer is Morgan Burkhardt. Our theme music, Igneous Grok, was composed and performed by Vin Marquardt. For my co-host Bill Schmidt, I'm Paul Giesting. Until next time.